Hello and welcome to Tiski Sour. It's day 2 of Labour Party conference and day 2 of our for the first time ever nightly Tiski Sours. Every night at 8 p.m. Tonight I am joined by an absolutely stellar lineup. Novara Media editor Dalia Gebrial. How's it going?
It's going good. I'm absolutely wrecked, but delirious, which I think is a perfect combination for a Labour Party conference.
Ronan Burtenshaw, editor of the newly launched Tribune magazine, which we will be talking about today. Are you similarly delirious?
Unbelievably exhausted, but yeah, I'm delighted to be here. First time on Novara, so...
Yeah, I can't believe it's your first time on
Novara.
Novara.
On the other side of that camera, giving you sarky comments for months of this show, so it's great.
And finishing our lineup for the evening, it's Bhaskar Sunkara, editor of Jacobin magazine.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
How's it going?
Oh, it's going great. I've been waking up early, going on runs, drinking lots of mineral water. Good.
Is that true? You're
No.
actually going on runs in the
No,
morning?
I'm very hungover every morning.
You're a regular at Labour Party conference now?
Yes. I don't have a Labour Party of my own yet, so we're still working on it.
Do you go to... Yeah, actually, do you go to the Democratic convention? Does that only happen every 4 years?
Well, I guess you're spoiling the lead. We're going to talk about the party structures and how they're different, I guess.
But we're going to...
So the DNC is like the worst part of the Labour Party. The young men in ill-fitted suits and the business kiosks, but that's all of it. There's some fun things on the side, but I've been to it once, and it's only every 4 years. I probably wouldn't go to it again.
What did you go to? Did you go to the most recent one?
Yeah, I went to the most recent one.
Sick. Yeah. But did Bernie speak?
Bernie did speak.
He was bullied into doing an endorsement for Hillary Clinton.
Oh, I don't know. He wanted to do it. It's a weird political system. He felt like he didn't have any other choice, but it's uninspiring. I imagine it would be like being at a mid 2000s Labour Party conference.
Yeah, I wasn't there. I don't know what it was like. It's probably incredibly miserable. But we were in government, and you can't change anything unless you're in government. You also can't go to wars with Middle Eastern countries unless you're in government. There's loads of things you can't do in government. But we'll get on to the proper differences between the situation of the American left in the Democratic Party and ourselves here. First of all, a little update of what's been going on today. Policy announcements. We're going to tax second homes to tackle homelessness. I was disappointed we're only taxing the homes that people have as their holiday homes. I think we should do a really brutal tax on anyone who owns more than one property. But step by step. Angela Rayner today, this isn't really a policy announcement, but she wants to ban anonymous social media accounts. And we're also going to get rid of academies and free schools.
Yeah,
You've got problems with anything. You look like you're unhappy.
I mean, not with the academies and free school thing. It's just that banning anonymous social media accounts is. Firstly, I don't know how you do that, and also, anonymous. It's this idea that anonymous social media accounts are only used by trolls, but it's also sometimes activists and people have real reasons for needing to use pseudonyms.
To be fair, 95% trolls.
They are, yeah, but also I don't think the answer is just banning anonymous accounts, because there are people need pseudonyms for reasons other than to tell you that you're a piece of shit.
And there's one thing over here as well, right? So you're using a social media account anonymously here. Chances of you being a troll or whatever are fairly high. A lot of countries where you get persecuted for putting your name to political statements so that's I suppose the question then as well. And even for migrants, so if you're coming from say a migrant to Britain from a country, Turkey, for instance, where Jacobin, one of our contributors, has recently been arrested, is in prison in Turkey. If you're a Turkish migrant over here using your name, criticizing Erdogan, you got to do that anonymously. So, I think you got to think through a policy like that sounds good. Got to think it through.
Yeah, and on that point, it's because of if you don't allow people to use kind of pseudonyms in those kind of contexts, you're essentially excluding them from the public sphere of the internet, which is disastrous. But yeah, I'm thinking about I'm organizing sex workers at the moment, and most of them wouldn't use their they don't use their like name for work, let alone like to put themselves out into the public sphere. I think it's bullshit.
Bhaskar, anonymous accounts?
Yeah, I think it's a dangerous, bad idea. I think the state should have no business regulating what people are doing unless they're doing direct enticements to violence and so on.
You're not even called Sunray, are you?
Well, my name is Bhaskar Kiran, so Sunray. In Hindi, sorry. Bhaskar, Hindi. It's like Hindi for sun, and Kiran is Hindi for Ray.
Oh,
yeah,
nice.
So I am.
Okay, great. So that would be allowed. Angela Rayner would be fine with that. I think that would stand up in court. Is taxing second holiday homes enough? We're doubling their VAT. Should we just abolish them?
Abolish holiday homes?
Yeah.
How would you? The question is how you would do that. I agree with you.
Well, you could do a 70% tax on any home after your first one.
But it's nowhere near enough to, I don't think, just go after holiday homes. So you want to see how the policy is rolled out. But you're right. It's a question of, ownership of second and third homes. And it's a bigger one. Actually, Grace Blakey wrote a piece for us in our first issue about this on financialisation of housing, which talks about the fact that the problem of housing now is that, particularly in Britain, London being the forefront of it, it's just the plumbing of the international financial system. So there's tons of money sloshing around in the financial system without very many reliable investments. Property is the one, and so people are plowing money into it. And unless you deal with that, so you've got to actually stop the money coming into it to deal with the problem. And that's something, that's a hard policy to come up with.
So what, you're talking about capital controls?
When I talk about capital controls on a show like yours. No, I think there's a number of different ways that you can do it in terms of limiting people's ability to purchase. But in the broader scheme, that's what you've got to do. You've got to look at like property in London, particularly in the context of the international financial system, and come up with an answer for, how do you stop this? We've been told for such a long time, investment, foreign direct investment particularly, is always good. And in many cases it is, arguing that foreign direct investment isn't important. But, foreign direct investment and investment particularly in things like property massively distorts the economies for people who actually live in them. And we've had obviously similar stuff back where I'm from in Ireland, where we've in the last 20 years has become a massive tax haven. And obviously on one side you can see some benefits from that in terms of jobs in finance, pharma, tech, but the other side of it is huge parts of the city have just been taken over by major multinationals, which don't really have any kind of accountability connection to local communities. And there's a real question to be asked: why is that money and that investment that's just massively increasing property prices, whatever, why is that improving people's lives? It isn't.
What happened? This is a question I could have asked 10 years ago, but what happened to Ireland's property bubble? You had a property bubble in 2008 which crashed like harder than ours, but is house prices and rent just as high as ever now?
Dublin is the second most expensive city in Europe for rent, which is interesting. Having moved over.
What's the first?
To London. So that was been my transition in the last few months, moving from
second
Dublin
to first.
Yeah, so it's got me.
You're going up in the world, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's what I was thinking. Yeah, but anywhere I could have picked, but Dublin still has actually there's movements in the street in Ireland at the moment. Something called Take Back the City, which is campaigning on the housing crisis. We have a huge housing crisis in Dublin, which comes back to that same issue we were talking about.
Great. Obviously, the controversies yesterday. I kind of feel like it's almost disappointing because the most interesting decision of Labour Party conference was made yesterday. It was about the NEC recommendations for rule changes. Today, the news has been, we were watching Sky News today all day, they've been making a big deal about a Brexit vote and anti-Semitism. I think neither of those are actually going to become stories. I think Brexit is very likely to end up with a compromise position which will get passed on the conference floor, which will ultimately say the Labour Party should keep all options on the table, go for a general election and maybe have a second vote. It doesn't seem like that. I don't think anything's going to change there. And the other thing they've been talking about is anti-Semitism, and nothing's actually happened. They just keep saying, it's the Labour Party, so people are expecting there could be an anti-Semitism row. And it hasn't happened yet, so you just make the news up. But the one thing that was significant that has been decided is reforming selection processes so that no one has a job for life. When we talk about that, we often say, we want candidates like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. That's sort of like the positive way of framing it. not that this is just about framing it, that's also the reason we want it. We want Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Why would we want to get rid of anyone? This is a positive thing. Looking at this as an American, does it seem bizarre to you that this is even controversial? The idea that an MP should face something along the lines of a primary every 4 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's common sense that MPs should be accountable to their base. What's unusual about the U.S., though, is the system isn't exactly one-to-one in that in some parts of the U.S. we have truly open primaries, which mean that members and supporters of opposing parties can actually vote in the primaries. So, like, I registered as a Democrat when I was 18 years old. I became a socialist when I was 14, and I didn't just have a momentary lapse. The day I got my driver's license, you go there and they say, do you want to register to vote? Because, of course, you have to make a proactive effort in the U.S. because they want to limit the voter rolls. And then you check, I'm going to be a Democrat, Republican, or I'm going to be a independent or Green Party member and so on. I lived in New York State, which is a state that is heavily dominated by the Democratic Party. I lived in a Democratic Party district. So the only competitive elections in my area was the Democratic Party. I've never paid dues to the Democratic Party. I've spent the last 10 years attacking the Democratic Party. I cannot get expelled from the Democratic Party. I can't discipline to the Democratic Party. I vote in almost every Democratic Party primary. I've never interacted with the Democratic Party because those are state-run primaries. So it is a completely different system. But obviously, I agree with a move toward mandatory reselection. But the comparisons are often very, very glib. And also in general, the U.S. is a terrible place in many ways. Terrible political system. I think it's maybe a holdover from the Blair days when to win an argument in the Labour Party, you had to say, oh, look, our friends across the Atlantic are doing it this way to keep bringing up the comparison.
Well, when you bring up the American comparison, what the person you're debating will say is that what's being proposed within Labour is to make it easier for members to replace their current MP, and what's the case in the United States is that it's voters who can, because as you say, you don't have to pay dues. You can't be a member of the Democratic Party, right?
You can't, yeah.
And do you think that's something we should be embracing or resisting? Should we be having open primaries, or should the left be saying, like, no, it should be party members only?
So to risk going into a tangent, what we're trying to do within DSA, Democratic Socialists of America...
There are no tangents on Tisky Sour.
And when within kind of our system is to essentially create the first political party. So we're actually trying to impose discipline. So in other words, the old debate on the left was either you're going to run in the Democratic Party to try to take it over, or you're going to run in a third party. And the third party route is almost impossible in the U.S. because of our very restrictive ballot laws. One of our editors, Seth Ackerman, says that just at the level of electoral laws, not political freedoms, it's closer to a semi-authoritarian country like Singapore or Russia than it is to any other democracy.
Why is that, sorry?
So if you're running in a district with 50,000 people, you might need to, even before you get on the ballot, you might need to get 3,000 signatures. And those signatures are going to be vetted one by one. If there's minor errors, so legal fees, volunteers, you need all this before you even get to be on a ballot line and be the choice that no one's voting for because it's a winner-take-all, election. So what we're trying to do now is pursue, I was about to say third way, but I guess I just did.
I'm in the third way,
Yeah.
Language is flexible.
Yeah.
It's a floating signifier.
We're trying to pursue a third way within the Democratic
Party. The new center ground.
Which is to run candidates not to take over the party. Because there is no real party like we were discussing. But so a lot of the Burtenshaws see this diffusion as a source of strength. We think of this diffusion as actually a source of power for capital, because you don't have one leadership election to win. You don't have one barricade to storm. You conquer one thing and power diffuses to another part, right? So what we're doing is running open socialist candidates that broadly should agree to, let's say, 10 principles. And we're not quite there yet, but we're trying to find ways to discipline them in some way. So in other words, they could vote their conscience on most things, but on certain things, on matters of war, on imperialism, on keep social policy, they'll have to vote in bloc. This is a parliamentary,
And how do you discipline them?
Well, you need to make sure that if they're going to get the endorsement, they have to be getting their funding from powerful membership-driven organizations and maybe affiliated unions attached to it. The Democratic Socialists of America is not that organization yet, but I think we're one part of maybe like a 3 or 4 component thing that in the future could create this. But often we're going to be running through Democratic primaries as opposed to just independents. And hopefully we get to the point where we could reform our electoral laws so we can build something like a membership party, which might not be a Labour Party, but it will be a left party that is driven around organizing the working class, if not necessarily through the institutions of
Is there not a chance they'll kick you out as entryists if you sort of say we're starting this party within the Democratic?
You can't. This is the ridiculous thing. You can't get
kicked out. It would be illegal.
So they have left it. They created this awful system for left-wing politics, but then they left this giant space open, which comes with all kinds of difficulties, you know, in the history of the left, I think, trying to organise in the States in relationship to the Democratic Party. But it's undeniable that this argument about the ballot line is a massive open space, because they can't just do that. They can't just kick you out for being entryists. And on the other side, of course, with the Republicans, you see the same. So you see all these, you know, completely off the wall, you know, neo-Nazis and so on, who've started to get through in primaries and because they can't be kicked out. And that's the system.
It's interesting. I mean, one of the things that's obviously the fact that Labour is a membership organisation, is now a mass party, and we have Twitter, is one of the reasons that we have to spend 50% of our time debating what some nut job who happens to be the campaign organiser in like East Norfolk said about the relationship of his MP to Israel or something like that. It's sort of stuff that would never be in the news because it's just some activist who doesn't have a formal position but suddenly finds himself on the front page of the Times because they said something dumb like 2 years ago. And actually and I think that's really difficult, like what Labour is going to have to do, how one becomes a mass party in an age of social media without that sort of dragging you into really dry, boring debates about whether or not everyone in your 500,000 membership is completely reasonable or without prejudice. So in a way of having loose membership is a benefit in a way, because you can't say, well, he's a registered Democrat and he's an idiot, because you just say, well, everyone's a fucking registered Democrat.
But you got to push back on that argument in general, which is not to be like excusing of people who, you know, are saying apparent things, but this kind of attempt, I think, to look at politics at the moment in this kind of really changeable world that we're in, where for so long politics retreated away from people, people had less and less of a sense of connection with it. There's this, you know, very clear sense, if you go to any working class community now in this country and all the way across the West, really, to be honest, that politics has nothing to do with them. It's out there, it's not related to people and so on. To try and turn that around then and say, well, what we're going to expect is the kind of political practice of somebody who's been a decades-long activist, who's a politician, who's a councillor, who's a whatever. They have to have totally polished language. They have to have totally polished ideas. And if they don't, we're gonna chuck them out. We're gonna make a major controversy over them. We're gonna rake them over the coals in public. We're gonna be taking them through the tabloids. That is, I mean, if you accept the terms of that, that's the end of popular politics. It's the end of kind of any chance you have, I think, of engaging in mass politics. So that has to be pushed back against as an argument too.
Dalia?
Yeah, I think that this is a really important point, and I think it's coming through now with the fact that, like you said, every kind of like member is being like, their Twitter account is being like raked through. I mean, obviously it's not happening to every member, but this idea that people who are that it's, you know, I don't think it's a thing that's inherent to like the form of the party. I think it's that it is a useful tool to use, because when you think about this idea that, you know, in order to have a mass movement, in order to take Corbynism seriously, everyone that calls himself a Corbynite has to be like perfectly like slick and on it. They never say that about like yesterday we had a debate about nationalism and, you know, the Labour Party, and one thing that so it was like Maurice Glasman, who's founder of Blue Labour, and John Denham, who is founder of the English Labour Network, which is the last thing that we need in 2018. But basically, you know, one of the points that they kept making was that, you know, in order to win elections, we're going to have a broad base, and in order to have a broad base, there are going to be some people with like prejudices. They're going to be people who express racist sentiment, but we can't, you know, we have to meet them where they are. We can't reject them. So this argument that like we have to meet people where they are is only spared for when it like benefits the status quo in some way. So like we have to be accepting of like, you know, prejudices that are brought in by the so-called white working class, but then when it comes to like the Corbynite base and, you know, problematic views that might exist there, it's, oh my goodness, this is like a smear on the entire movement. So what I'm trying to say is basically that I think even if every single one of us were word perfect, I don't actually think that's not the point here. That's not what's going on here. It's not, you know, and I think that's why we need to be bolder, I think, when taking on these smear campaigns, because they aren't responding to like an objective reality. The script's already written from their end. Like, so there isn't actually much that we can do. Like, because people, you know, when you have a broad-based movement, like, you're going to get a lot, like, do you know what I mean? Like, people don't operate like politicians, like when you actually are engaging like human beings.
There's an argument.
So like, I just think it's a completely cynical argument, and I don't think we should internalize it.
There's an argument I've heard which is quite interesting, and you, Bhaskar, might have something to say about it, because I think Jacobins sort of entered into these debates a lot in the States, which is that what's going on in the Labour Party now is the kind of campus politics of the left, where so much of its energy was directed to purging anyone who wasn't perfect within that movement. So you spend so much time debating who's allowed to be part of the movement and not that much time debating what your actual objectives are.
Yeah.
And now the right have sort of seen that. They've seen that we're a bit self-conscious about that. And if they point out that some of us have prejudice, we kind of freak the fuck out. And then they sort of seen we've got 500,000 people who have Twitter, and they're like, he's fucked. And we're like, whoa, they are fucked. And we haven't really managed to get any perspective about it.
They're using those tactics against us. And that's like, I think a lot of us were saying, like, can we not do politics in this way? Because once you start saying, oh, everyone can like self-define their oppression and everyone can like it gets out of hand very quickly. And I think we've seen that over the past summer, like very, very starkly.
Yeah, and I think there's a way we can handle these things within the left. So, for example, if Ronan says something that offends me, you know, I can, if we're in a left-wing setting,
what do you do?
Then I think yes, but you would assume good faith.
Tribune magazine.
Yeah, I mean, but I think within left settings, we should just start with assuming good faith, and then address the problem. Maybe a couple of people address the person, explain kind of the issue, and if the behavior continues, then that is someone that should be purged, right? But often the left doesn't start with the assumption of good faith and the assumption that, hey, if we're all in this left-wing meeting about this campaign, chances are we share at least many of the same moral principles. And I think that's always the healthiest place to be. So we often are within New York, DSA, within DSA as a whole, there's very contentious debates, but the best ones are not even where people are closest necessarily, but if they agree to that broad principle, then, you know, you're in better shape. But there has to be also a point when we say that certain things aren't acceptable. But there is also that difference between active party cater, people showing up and doing things like canvassing, and people are just voting. I agree that, you know, we're going to, in any mass political party, win over the votes of people who have many abhorrent views. And I mean, there's not much you can do about that. You're probably winning them on, let's say, jobs or the NHS, and they might have really reactionary views on immigration. They might say, well, I really disagree with what Corbyn says on immigration, but I really like what the Labour Party is saying about, you know, point A and point B. And that's just the way politics works. And I think sometimes the debate gets skewed. We conflate the two between, you know, what our organizers should, how they should behave and how they should be held accountable, and just the general party membership or the general, voters.
I want to move on to Tribune in a second, but first I want to, because we're now talking about how the British establishment are throwing the kitchen sink at the Corbyn movement. And I mean, it feels like the establishment has lost on policy, so they're finding any other different mechanism that they can attack him
I'm
on.
not sure they ever won. I don't think that's how they work.
Well, so if you say in the 90s, an election would have been won by the Tory parties by saying Labour will double your tax. You know, so they would clamp down. Even in 2015, the Tories basically won that election on the idea that Labour are irresponsible with money and austerity works. And I feel like, so that was basically, I mean, there was also like Ed Miliband can't eat a sandwich, but ultimately that was a message, that was an election that was fought on the message discipline of saying we can handle the economy, the Labour Party can't. Even though that was based on a lie, it was substantive, you know, that was a policy issue. Whereas now, all they can do is say they're terrorist sympathisers, he's an anti-Semite, I can't even remember what the other ones are. He's a Czech spy, da-da-da-da-da.
And it's a cultural thing too. I think they are going through looking at what the narrative is and what they're trying to do. trying to portray the Labour Party as culturally out of touch with the people who would benefit from its policies, its policy programme. So where they see that disjuncture in place, they're putting a pressure on the tension every single time. And look, they've had some serious success with it. I think if I was in their position, it's exactly what I would do as well, because they don't have a policy programme to address the fundamental issue, which is they have no idea how to get the economy back on track in a way that benefits the social majority. So when they don't have that, and they really don't, well then this is the way to try and break apart the Labour coalition. And it works to a certain extent, but just seeing that the other day with who was the guy who came out again, was the former Goldman Sachs guy who came out saying that the radical left in Britain was offering...
Oh yeah, I haven't seen that yet. Yeah. But I saw on Twitter people saying this ex-Goldman Sachs fellow was saying that.
Can't remember his name, but I read the piece. I'm sure people watching this can go and find it. But it was just one of a whole series of comments that have come out recently from leading business figures. And if you read the business press, and particularly what they write to themselves in their magazines and stuff, they've been saying this for some time. The radical left has a policy programme. They know what they want to do. They have an answer. We don't. And so that's the position I think they're kind of in.
But maybe they were too slow to kick out a couple of cranks on Twitter, and that means the whole project should just die. Bhaskar, I wanted to ask you, so you're seeing sort of candidates and movements similar in politics to Corbyn achieving sort of unprecedented success in the United States in terms of recent history. Ocasio-Cortez, obviously Bernie 2 years ago, maybe in 2020, Julia Salazar. What are you seeing? What is the strategy to delegitimize them, to try and destroy them in the public view?
Well, I mean, we have the slight advantage in the United States that that there's so many races. It's so fragmented. The races are on really irregular cycles. The party's so incoherent.
We both thought you meant races. You know, like we have Mexicans and blacks, Chinese.
Yeah. We have all sorts of races. Yeah. And you know, at first I was uncomfortable about it, but the food is so much better. You know, it's so much better. But anyway.
Sorry, continue the point.
So for viewers at home, I am have not become a race scientist in the past 20 minutes. But
I thought you were sort of saying that there's so many races they can't really pin anyone down for any particular prejudice because it's a huge melting pot of hate.
Yes. But I mean, I think often in these now I can't even say the word in these election contests. There's so low turnout, and there's so many of them that we want it more than the bourgeoisie. Like, I remember not even these DSA races have been winning, but I was thinking about this Trotskyist organization in the U.S., Socialist Alternative, and they ran a city council race in Minneapolis, a pretty big city in the upper Midwest of the U.S., and, you know, Timor was a candidate. He was a pretty good candidate. A lot of us from around the left were supporting him. And he came within 1%. He had some union backing, too, just 1%. And everyone was like, wow, this is like almost a tremendous upset. And it was. You know, he was running as an independent socialist against an entrenched, you know, a Democratic incumbent. But if you look at, actually, the broad left, outspent the incumbent candidate like 3-1. Why? Because it's a city council race. You think Goldman Sachs cares about a city council race? No, but we cared about it, right? We had more canvassers. It's so easy to get people on the streets to knock on doors for a cause. It's really hard for a 20-year Democratic incumbent to get people to knock on doors because, hey, I really want to keep my job. So I think in a lot of these low turnout races, or even local district races as a whole, you know, we have the people and we have the volunteers, and we could actually win district by district a lot of races. Where we might have trouble, though, is still at the national level. I think Bernie is probably, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez will be this, I think, she's not even 35 yet, so she can't run for president. But I think she seems like the most promising one who could be this at the national level. But Bernie is really our only national figure. And we don't even have people who could win statewide races. Like Cynthia Nixon, people, I think afar, a lot of the UK press, a lot of the European press that was looking at this race saw it as a novelty. Oh, this, you know, actress from Sex and the City is running against this Democratic incumbent. But it was a really serious race. She adopted very left-wing positions on labor issues. She consulted with DSAs labor commission about a lot of these issues. She had great staff. She's someone who says she's a democratic socialist, and I hated when the media at the end, but even by the end of the race, kept calling her a self-described democratic socialist. You know, like she's just a democratic socialist. She came to this politics. She was obviously influenced by a lot of people, a lot of movements, but she only got 33% of the vote. So we still need to build that statewide, nationwide races. But I think you'll see every few months you'll hear, you know, stories about a special election or something getting won by someone who's a self-described social democrat or democratic socialist.
But I suppose what I mean is, so take Bernie just as a prime example. He's someone whose policies look like they would threaten the establishment. You have a media that's even more fucked up than ours. I would expect to have seen over the last 2 years, once Bernie seemed like a genuinely credible candidate to be president in 2020, that he would have had the kitchen sink thrown at him and all sorts of bonkers accusations. Has that happened, or?
Well, he did on certain issues. Like the idea of the Bernie bro is just objectively wrong. Like Bernie's, if you had to create a stereotype of a Bernie voter, and of course he got support from a cross section of the population, it would be young white women in their 20s. I mean, that was his initial base in the primaries. And then over the course of the primaries, his base widened to particularly young Black and Latino voters. And people often viewed it in, like, liberal media in the U.S. viewed it in the most kind of racist and condescending way. They're like, oh, Bernie's not talking Black enough to win Black voters in the South in these early primaries. Or Bernie's message, oh, of course Black voters wouldn't be interested in these, you know, issues that Bernie cares about. You know, if you look at the actual data of like why people were voting the way they were voting, Black voters in the South in early primaries were voting for Hillary Clinton because she had higher name recognition. Almost no one knew who Bernie was, and she was perceived as being more electable. On policy issues, these voters were closer with Bernie, but they didn't really know him, they didn't know his message, and they were really afraid that Donald Trump would win. The constituencies that stand the most to lose by a right-wing Republican winning are going to vote for a reliable incumbent Democrat. So the big challenge for the left is not just to win these safe Democratic seats, but can we convince people to vote for kind of more left-wing, more radical candidates in these contesting seats? And it won't be a matter of false consciousness or people voting against their interests. It's people genuinely concerned for good reason. So we need to show people that we can win, you know, elections, general elections with our candidates on the left.
You just moved to London, haven't you, Ronan? Where were you living before that?
Dublin, but I was, as Europe editor for Jacobin, never in one place very long.
Oh, so you're just hopping around a lot?
Yeah.
What's the situation in Ireland? You don't have a Bernie or a Corbyn, do you?
No, we don't. The situation in Ireland is
we both got lucky. There was just some random old guy who was in the right place at the right time, and now we've got a socialist movement. Sure.
Probably the guy who fits the bracket best in Ireland for that category is our president, which is like just a ceremonial position, but he's up for re-election soon, who would have been like a long-time Labour left activist as well, called Michael D. Higgins. And he's, you know, overwhelmingly popular, going to probably romp home, I would say, in this presidential election as well. We had a great few years between 2014 and the start of 2016 with the water movement, which was the biggest social movement in the history of the southern state.
What was that? It was against privatising it?
So it's the right to water movement. It came in at the beginning, it was against the introduction of charges, but with the understanding that the introduction of charges was commodifying water and also was being done. So like water charges were coming in with private companies effectively working on the networks. So you were ending up in a situation where Dennis O'Brien, who was one of the most prominent oligarchs of Irish society, was going to be directly involved in the rollout of this charge scheme. So people are not stupid, you know. They understood what that meant, and there was a huge movement against the water charges. We got between 100 and 200,000 people out in the streets multiple times over years in big demonstrations in a country in the Republic which is 4.4 million. So it's huge demonstrations. And that was our austerity moment. That was like Ireland's moment, like the Quince movement in Spain or like Syriza. That was the moment for us. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to consolidate it into a new political project that could make a breakthrough. So the left in Ireland is on a bit of a retreat now. But like I said, the housing movement on the back of the movement to repeal the Eighth and the context around that. There are lots of positives, but if you look at the numbers in terms of social support and so on as well, we're on a bit of a back foot at the moment.
Just smashing it on social issues.
No, there's no question. Yeah. Well, Ireland has just fundamentally changed. So I was talking last night. It's something it's a close one to me because my mum was a long time pro-choice activist. I grew up in that, in a house where that was the case. She was the head of the Well Woman at the time the X case happened, which was in the early 90s. One of the worst. It was one of the really big scandals. A 14-year-old kid raped by her uncle was refused permission by the government to leave to have an abortion, and miscarried. And it was an unbelievably horrendous legal battle. And during that period, I was I was very young, but very aware as well of the level of tensions around it. So my mum would have got bomb threats to her office multiple times, attacks on the house multiple times. So I was well aware what the hardcore of the opposition on that issue were like. And to see the change from that in the early 90s to a massive vote in favour of abortion rights in the repeal referendum was incredible. I mean, really incredible. That's a very, very fast social change. You don't often see change happening that quickly and that fundamentally, and people who fought for that over decades and people who fought in that campaign deserve enormous credit for it. Really do.
Dalia?
Yeah, I was thinking about the Bernie bro thing and how that was kind of done to Corbyn as well. I remember when he first it's gone down a little bit less now, but when he first came on the scene, there was very much this thing of Corbyn is against women and Corbyn is whatever. And I think this is a really distressing development because it demonstrates a kind of, and particularly when it comes to race politics and gender politics, it signifies a kind of fragmentation of race and gender politics from class politics. So it's this idea that Bernie being for universal healthcare, Bernie being for single payer healthcare is not a policy that is an anti-racist policy or is not a feminist policy. And in the same way that, Corbyn being an anti-imperialist, I actually had an argument with Jess Phillips about this on Twitter, where she was kind of trying to smear Jeremy. It was when Angela Eagle was being pushed as his potential opponent, and she was trying to smear Corbyn as a misogynist. And I was like, if your definition of woman is outside cis, middle class, white, being anti-war is a feminist policy. Being anti-imperialist is a feminist policy. And Jess Phillips was like, no one cares about war. No one cares about this. These aren't... She literally was like, no one cares about war. And no, she said that in the interview she did with Owen Jones. And it was it's amazing how she can carry the feminist mantle in the Labour Party, but not think that that's related to being a colonialist, being an imperialist. And I guess what I really wanted to know what your opinion on this was do you think that the fact that an argument like that can be made, that Bill Clinton can be called the first black president of the US because he played the saxophone, but he introduced carceral politics that was has been hugely destructive to the black community. Do you think that's shrewdness of the right or the centre or failure of the left?
I think part of it is it's not even a conspiracy in the vacuum of left politics, especially in the US and left movements. Most people are coming to journalism or coming to politics without the experience of what working class or even social democratic politics looks like or what reforms look like. So there's not even the thinking through. There's just kind of the level of Hillary Clinton's talking about gender and race more than Sanders in this kind of way. But especially in the place of the U.S. where we don't have a universal health care, what does it mean if you're a woman stuck in a abusive or just bad relationship and you're relying on your spouse's health care? Yeah, so when Sanders supporters would make points like this, they would say, well, you're reducing everything to class or whatever. And I think this is I think it's just a lack of, part of it is just a lack of seriousness and a lack of actual movements to push a counter narrative. And you can't really win these battles on Twitter because a lot
Shit.
of these terrains.
You can't.
Yeah, you can.
Well,
'cause-
what are we
Fuck, man,
doing
what are we
here, then?
doing?
I mean, most of the U.S. isn't college educated. They're not in the same milieus of the people engaging in a lot of these debates.
No, I was joking.
No, I know. Sorry. I understand.
Michael gets schooled by Bhaskar Sunkara about
That's
how you
good.
can't actually just achieve social change on Twitter.
Yeah,
It's going to be shareable right there.
Well, that's mostly because you
good.
only tweet about like extremely obscure things, like making reference between basketball and the Bolshevik Revolution or something bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I just I occasionally tweet generally inoffensive things, So, but I think that you need to go out and you need to talk to people, and I think most. There's lots of polling about the policy desires or the highest priorities for voters who are Black, Latino, and white. Not surprisingly, they're basically exactly the same. Some of the orders are reversed. Why? Because we have 99.9% the same DNA. We've been forced into, in many ways, a common condition of precarity, of difficulties, and all these people for the last 20, 30 years have been told by politicians that, it's your fault. Whatever's going on in your life, unemployed, don't have healthcare, debt, it's your fault. You should have, take a coding class, reformat your CV, whatever else. And this is, I think, the level that politics worked when we were knocking on doors and canvassing for Sanders in places like New Hampshire or even places like West Virginia, where he won every county in the Democratic primary, and that's now a Republican state. And so he won every county in the Democratic primary.
Oh, that was one that went.
And now
Republican from Democrat.
It's been Republican for a little bit, but it was the seat of this new kind of teachers movement arose from West Virginia. A lot of the people were connected. Ed networks started from the Sanders campaign, so it didn't just go away. But I think even more so in the U.S. and the U.K., a lot of these debates or arguments aren't really translating, but they are just creating a more just a bad atmosphere for people passively trying to catch up and trying to figure out what's what. And it doesn't help that the left doesn't acknowledge something like, well, Hillary Clinton can both be a perpetuator of policies and make it worse for disadvantaged women and also a victim of sexism, right? And I think if you're in the Bernie bro narrative and you're trying to counter it, we would sometimes not add that caveat, which seems obvious because we know this is what we believe in our moral sentiments. But for people looking on the outside, they wouldn't see that, they would just accept the narrative and they wouldn't see a rebuttal or a caveat.
Let's, I want to know the story of Tribune, and then we're going to take questions from our YouTube audience. So, Ronan, give me the pitch. What's it all about? Where'd it come from?
Well, obviously, Tribune didn't come from us. Tribune is a tradition that long predates us, long predates Jacobin, and that was a large part of what attracted us to it. I was speaking last night at the launch about how we think of the project, because the question that we got from everyone thus far is, why did you do this? Pretty much every journalist we've spoken to about the project turns around and says, why did you not just start a Jacobin or equivalent in the UK? Why did you? And it is because at a certain level we think it's important on the left to talk about tradition. And I don't just mean in terms of Tribune, although obviously people like Nye Bevan and Michael Foot, people like Jenny Lee, pioneering Minister for the Arts, Ellen Wilkinson, one of the earliest writers about the conditions facing working class women in Britain, Barbara Castle passed the Equal Pay Act. Obviously it has its own phenomenal tradition, but there's a general point too. And I think this is something people need to get their head around. A lot of the time, arguments that are made about the right, from the right about us, they're trying to give us a sense of our tradition to diminish it. So, for a long time, socialists were dinosaurs. Last few years were, young and naive. Now those things, the idea that we're a rabble or mob and whatever. The idea that our politics are not serious. Whereas actually, the kind of mass movements that is our heritage were the ones that won just about everything that makes a society we live in worthwhile, worth living in. And that is our tradition. And when people have a sense of that, have a sense of their association to it, and a sense of what came before them, and people struggle to get to this point, I think they have much greater ability to hold their head up and fight back against the slander that the left, that socialists get from the right. So there is a general point for us as well in terms of tradition and rebuilding institutions that places the new movements in their historical context, and that says very clearly that the historical analysis of the left has been vindicated by the last 100 years, been vindicated by the last decade as well. So much of what we hear and have heard for a long time has talked about, things that the left got wrong. But we were right about capitalism, and we know it now.
Yeah, I feel like the reason that I became like a lefty was because I remember just sitting in history classes when I was in school and just being like, the left always just seemed to be on the right side of things. Like, it just always seems to work out that, like, there's just like, these guys just seem, so I'll go there then. Do you know what I mean? Like, and I think also, like, it is a really important point of, like, and I think particularly in, and this is like globally, not just in the UK and the US, but, I'm thinking about like Egypt, which, I know just because like I'm originally from there, and like I'm like connected to some of the movements in there, that were there. And it's generally this feeling that people feel like they aren't in control of their destiny, or of the destiny of the communities that they live in. And I think that knowing that kind of history, knowing about our wins, knowing about the things that we've won, even if we've won them in a way that, like, okay, we started campaigning for them at this point, but like consensus didn't really happen until like this point, or we didn't win in the way that we initially set out to win. We won like in kind of other roundabout ways. It's about like people seeing themselves as agents of like social change and as agents of history. And like I often think like how different would like our perception of ourselves be if we like had a full understanding of like the victories of or even like the things that weren't necessarily victories, but like how would we perceive things like unions differently? How would the conversation around unions be different if we centered the victories that we've won through those like infrastructures, the weekend and holiday pay and sick pay, and those things are never like, there's a very deliberate attempt to kind of fracture like the victories of these social movements from the people that did them. And I think making those connections again is an important way for people to know how change happens, and also just to make people feel like they are agents of change, and that this kind of like individualist, like, oh, the reason that I'm like feeling shit about my life is because I never learned to code, is like the demoralizing side. This is a much more like hopeful and optimistic, wonderful part of our history. And I think we should like stop feeling so fucking depressed about it. Like, we should be fucking proud. We've been on the right side of history, like basically all the time.
Yeah. Over and over.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to questions. The first one is easy. When is Tribune in the shops? Could be rephrased as, how do you get a hold of this magazine? Hold it up while you're saying this.
So you get a hold of Tribune at tribunemag.co.uk. So at the moment, what we're doing is trying to build a base of subscriptions. It's fantastic that we've already in just a few days gone past 2,000 subscriptions, which is way, way, way beyond what we thought we were going to get. So I want to thank everyone who gave us their trust and their money for that, because we were talking about 3,000 by Christmas, and we'll probably get 3,000 by the end of the conference. So that's fantastic. It's $29.95 for an annual subscription. We are going to be in the shops as well. At the beginning, it'll be independent bookshops, but we aim to broaden out from there. Obviously, this project is starting now. It's at a very kind of early stage. The best way to get it is through our website, or you can come to our second launch event on Tuesday with Unite at Jury's Inn at 5:00, or any of our stalls at the World Transformed, which also have copies. So that's the best way of picking it up.
Sick. Next question. This is to you, Bhaskar, from Ben Kavanagh. What are Bhaskar Sunkara's goals in participating in the UK Labour Party process and conference? For example, are you seeking to learn from what happens here? Or are you trying to make a dramatic intervention, like change its course dramatically?
I would say I'm a socialist, so I'm committed to a world without hierarchy, without exploitation, without oppression. And I just happen to, by an accident of birth, be from the U.S. Actually, my parents were just looking to get into either Canada, the U.S., or the U.K. They were coming from Trinidad, so, Commonwealth is sometimes easier. I could very well. I think I would have been better off as Canadian. I think that's a safe answer, and it's probably right. Like, if I grew up right outside Toronto, it's like being from the northeast of the U.S. You get healthcare, like a little bit less fear of constant death, and than most Americans have to deal with. So, but yeah. So my goal is basically just to use the very odd skill set I have. I know now how to, and I didn't know when I started, how to produce print magazines and how to edit essays and things like that. And obviously Ronan's been kind of saving Jacobin in Europe for 2 years, and now I have to try to find someone else to do that. But yeah, so I have a very weird set of skills, and I want to be useful. But I think that as socialists, as internationalists, when we go into other contexts, we obviously begin by asking questions because we know less than the people who are actually in these contexts. But when it comes to our moral commitments, they shouldn't have any borders.
A harder question now. This is from OB. Does the panel think that if capitalism continues at the rate it does and socialism doesn't get a foot on the brake, will there be bloody revolution with guillotines and all that jazz?
I know. Right now, no. I mean, the revolution. This is the problem, right? Which is that, if it does start hitting a crisis phase now, we don't have the movements that we had 100 years ago that pushed some of those situations into directions that were more favourable. More likely is if it hits, as you say, it gets really messy at this stage, we're going to get deep authoritarianism, a lot of restrictions of civil liberties and people's freedoms, brutal crackdown on organised labour, trade union movement, further racist policies. That's the difficulty that we have. I think we do have to think about trying to construct on the left and to build the society we want to see, as opposed to hoping that the next crisis is going to bail us out, because we all thought 2008 and the aftermath was going to produce something fantastic, and we are where we are.
It did. It was just a decade late. When there was an old guy in the right place at the right time.
Well, look, it's better than where we were, but we're 10 years after that crisis, and we've had the Syriza breakthrough in Greece. Very good. Other than that, we've done well in some elections, but
very good for a little bit.
yeah. Okay, it was very good for a bit. Then we, exactly as you say, Syriza was defeated. Then we had some encouraging elections that we lost, and otherwise, Donald Trump is in power. The Tory party is way to the right of where it was. Large parts of Central and Eastern Europe are basically in the hands of a hardline right-wing nationalists. We've been beaten over the last 10 years, maybe less than we could have been, and there's some positive aspects to it, but we've been beaten.
There's another question with a follow-up as well, which is quite good. Thomas Randall. Are the best societies a blend of capitalism and socialism, or do you think full-on state control is the way to go? And then there's a follow-up. I guess I meant, do you think getting every country to be like Sweden or to be like North Korea is the best solution? In brackets, it isn't necessarily Sweden either. North Korea or Sweden, Bhaskar? What are we fighting for? What's the Tribune Jacobin editorial line?
Well, I mean, I haven't been to North Korea, so I can't pass judgments now. I mean, I think if you care about social democracy, right, you have to think about why social democracy got rolled back. Because I think the best society ever constructed, as flawed as it was Sweden in May 1975, May 13th, 1975. I scientifically calculated this. I'm a dialectical materialist, so I was able to figure this out. But what happened under social democracy? The power of workers were increased, right? So they started making more and more militant wage demands, but capital maintained all the structural power. So when the international context changed, when profitability got cut, capital was able to not make neoliberalism because of some ideological thing, right? Neoliberalism was less ideological and it was more just about capital saying, our profitability is getting cut. We need to restore profitability. Therefore, we need less regulations and we need less meddlesome unions. That was the start of the rollback. So if you care about making social democracy sustainable, you have to say, what power did capital have in that scenario and how do you take it away? Now, the way to take it away is through socializing the power of capital to flee, right? Capital flight, through socializing investment. And that's something that the Swedes tried to do with the Minder Plan. They tried to push for more radical industrial democracy, the left of the Swedish trade unions and the left of the Swedish Social Democratic Party. And that's the kind of models that we need. And it's actually pretty exciting that within the Labour Party, there's been thinking about these alternative models of ownership, about wage earner funds, like thinking that really hasn't been going on in a lot of parts of Europe in the 1970s, because there was really two routes to the crisis. Either resolve it to the left or you do what Gordon Brown and Tony Blair did, you know? And in many cases, it's not even a moral decision. Let's take Tony Blair out of it because he was just clearly from the beginning, you know, a Tory, yeah. But let's say someone like Gordon Brown, what was his logic throughout the 80s as he moved right? His logic was, this is the new environment. And the only way we could preserve the welfare state is by allowing this deregulation, but then growing the pie so that we could then tax it and then maintain the social welfare state. That was the solution to the right wing of social democracy. That's the solution we ended up with. It should be our gamble that there was a solution to the left wing of social democracy that would have led to something closer, or actually would lead to democratic socialism. So in other words, I'm for full socialism, but I think the road to it is through social democracy.
Good. Interesting. Coherent position. Agree?
Yeah, I mean, basically...
This is a strategy without guillotines.
Sure. I mean,
which relates to the last question. I mean,
we have to be realistic in one sense as well, and say that while we pursue that road, that you're aware of the context, right? So we know what happened to Salvador Allende, and we're not like, you know, forgetting that you can win power from the left as a socialist pursuing that road and still face against the reality that the other side are nowhere near as committed to democratic values as we are. So you've got to be realistic about that. But broadly speaking, yes, we've had... It's been 100 years since the Russian Revolution, and we do have to ask ourselves in the West, those of us on the left, certainly, like, you know, I think of this with myself, my own trajectory and how I place myself in socialist politics. We've spent an awful lot of time talking about that, but never really approached a circumstance like that in an advanced capitalist country again. People cite sometimes the Portuguese experience in post-dictatorship, which was, you know, definitely a democratic upsurge. Some people sometimes talk about May 68 and the openings that happened there, but like we really are grasping at straws in that case. And there's reason, which is that these societies, and it relates to your previous question too, even in times of crisis, advanced capitalist societies have shown themselves to be very durable and very able to adapt and withstand, and the only movements that are going to beat them are movements that are symmetrical, that are as durable, as able to adapt and withstand pressure as they are. So broadly speaking, yeah, I agree with Bhaskar.
There was one directly at you, but you can also answer the previous ones. Why does Dalia think English labour is a bad idea? Presumably you wrote a speech on this yesterday and you delivered it at Red, White and Blue Labour.
Is a question basically like, what do I think of nationalism or white or English?
Why specifically English Labour, the faction, is a bad idea?
Because I don't think that we should organise around national frameworks, and I think the idea of equivocating between English, like England, and like Scottish, like the idea of like Scottish Labour and the idea of English Labour, is like ridiculous, because Scottish Labour, like the idea of Scotland having, not Scottish Labour, sorry, the idea of Scotland having their own kind of like political infrastructures comes out of the fact that Scotland has been historically in an imperial relationship with the centre of power in England, which isn't what England has experienced. So it's just it's one of those things where it's like flattening the differences between like different nations and acting like just subbing in one for the other is like makes sense. But fundamentally, I just don't, for the same reasons that Bhaskar outlined, that, you know, nationhood is an accident of birth. I don't think that we should be articulating our politics through a national framework, essentially, or a framework that is centered around nationhood.
Right, it's been an hour. I think we all want to go get beers pretty soon. Final question. You can add in any final thoughts you want. Who's going to get socialism first? The UK or America? I don't just mean where's the socialist going to win first. I mean, who's going to get like real, proper ass socialism?
I would say, the United States, just because the United States is probably the only place in the world where you could have socialism in one country. You could essentially run it as a closed economy and increase the standard of living for the bottom 50% of the United States. Obviously, we would probably want something better than, importing like Hosier's model to the Albanian model to the U.S. But I think it just has better and more durable resources to do it and to withstand the pressure for an international capital. But obviously, it's a long way to go. I think we need to start with basic things like the fight for Medicare for all in the U.S. Because if you can't do something as decent as providing healthcare for all Americans, you can't put more radical questions on the table. But obviously, you're going to have a very good left social democratic government in at least a couple years.
Thanks. Ronan, who's getting it first? You can add in any other country if you want.
First, because the size of the movement here, it is worth thinking in our terms as well. When you look at the context Jacobin grew in, it's one of the reasons why Jacobin did remarkably, really. When you look at the American left, it just hasn't existed in such a long time. It's absolutely marginal, and it wasn't even until I kind of was over there and engaging with it a bit that I saw the difference between the size, even as it grows now, versus over here. The DSA, which is fantastic. It's great that it's grown, but it's like 50,000 members in a 300 and something million people country, right? The scales are different. I think here there is a serious possibility of as Bhaskar said, a left-wing social democratic government, and then the really interesting thing is which direction does it go when the pressure comes on? Is it going to be a Mitterrand government, which it could be? Is it going to have a Syriza experience, which it could do? And those are the kind of questions that are interesting to me when you've got a very sizable right-wing part of the parliamentary party, when you've got part of the infrastructure of the party, large parts of it still committed to the right. Where are those pressure points, and how can the movement around Corbyn fight to make sure that when the pressure comes on, the brake goes to the left? Because that's always been the challenge of left-wing social democratic governments, in Sweden too, as you were saying, is that the pressure comes on and there isn't enough to make the brake go leftwards.
Dalia?
So my initial instinctive response to that was Britain, and the reason was because I felt that Britain, and especially after Brexit, will become increasingly irrelevant as it's like a neo-colonial power, and therefore its irrelevance will mean that international institutions will be less, would throw less essentially at a socialist Britain than it would at a socialist America. But then on the other hand, maybe because the US doesn't, is in that kind of neo-colonial position, maybe that means that they have more agency. But I think basically that with, Britain's kind of the final kind of, empire didn't end in the post-war the post-war era. I think now is like the final blow of the British Empire, and I think that that increasing irrelevance on the global stage might mean that, international institutions won't be as send in the drones. They'll just be that's cute.
The final question I have to answer is, what happened to Barry Gardner? I did promise you
Barry
Gardner
what
yesterday.
Happened?
He cancelled on us this morning. I'm not going to tell you who's on tomorrow's show because everything's so up in the air at Labour Party conference. And, we're competing with Sky, the BBC, all these motherfuckers who want to interview the next government of England. I don't know why. The UK. Whoops. Or maybe we'll have broken up by then. Who knows? The breakup of Britain could be on the cards. In which case, having an English Labour would probably be that would just be what we would become. So maybe that's just foresight on the part of John Denham and Maurice Glassman, which should potentially be the first time. This was Tisky Sour. Thank you to my guests for joining me tonight. It's been a pleasure, as ever, to support Novara Media grow, to support us to continue doing what we do. We'd love to do a nightly show throughout the year, not just at Labour Party Conference. Please go to support.novaramedia.com. As you know, we're in the middle of our subsraiser. We're asking you to donate 1 hour's wage a month to our channel. I think we've got a new fundraiser advertisement that's going to come directly after this show, an unmissable minute and a half. I will see you tomorrow at 8 p.m. This was Tisky Sour. We are Novara Media. Good night.
I mean, it's mad when you think about it. We were just some chancers who started a radio show. We'd all come out of the student movement.
I actually didn't like Aaron when I first met him. Sorry.
We had protested against tuition fees. We'd occupied universities. We had, if you remember, we had been charged down by police on horseback in that freezing square, and we lost.
But a lot of us knew, I think, that there was this huge gap between the status quo and the future. But I think what we probably both agreed on was that we weren't represented much by the mainstream media or really by any political party.
And that it was time for us to transform it ourselves, right? And that this was the time to have those big ideas and be talking about those big ideas, and that they should come from us, from all of us.
I think if there's a moment when Novara became Novara, it was in 2015 when we interviewed Jeremy Corbyn in the leadership election, and it was the day that his odds were cut. He became the favourite. And there was almost a moment before that interview where I sat down and I thought, wow, this guy could be the Labour leader, and that meant that that brand of politics was very relevant, but also that our suspicions were right, and that actually Novara Media was on the cusp of something very, very, very important.
We're at a political tipping point, right? All the old assumptions are falling away. Another world is coming. And the question is, what's it going to look like? Neoliberalism's dying, innit? And Novara Media started what?
People don't know, but all our contributors are paid, but the overwhelming majority of the core team are purely volunteers, and that has to change. And that's why we're asking you to donate just 1 hour's worth of your monthly wage, and we will keep working round the clock to build a new media for a different politics.